very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think at a time when so much of the attention of the environmental community, the NGOs, and the agencies in charge of protecting biodiversity are increasingly focused on things like ecosystem services, eco-regional planning. I was really delighted to get an invitation to participate in a symposium focusing on extremely small populations. It's sort of the way I feel when I'm driving. I have the radio on. Yes, I do listen to the radio. And a song by the Eagles comes on. And I think to myself, damn, they're still good. They're still relevant. And that's sort of the way I feel about extremely small populations and protecting the most endangered species. They've been nudged off of center stream, and I'm not at all convinced that that's a welcome development. And it's a pleasure then to be among people who continue to be concerned about those species. So what I would like to do is give an admittedly idiosyncratic introduction to some of the interesting scientific and political issues surrounding the conservation of highly endangered species. Not perhaps with the full amount of analytical rigor that I think ought to be brought to this topic, and I will also flag some areas where I think some interesting data mining sorts of research could be done. So the key points that I would like to make this morning are first that when we're dealing with endangered species, and if we continue to be concerned about them, very small populations are the norm, at least within the United States. The second is that, notwithstanding what 2 generations of work in either biogeography, population viability analysis have led us to believe, we've been surprisingly successful at rescuing small populations when we put our minds to it. But doing so takes time, doing so takes money, and in the final analysis, those species we rescue may never be truly recovered in the sense of us having the ability to simply walk away from them and know that they will be out there for the indefinite future. So I'm going to work my way through a few of these issues. And let me begin with the first one, which is to make the case that extremely small populations are the norm within the United States when it comes to protecting endangered species. So this graph comes from a paper that colleagues and I at the Environmental Defense Fund published a long time ago. It's almost 20 years old, but basically what we did is we looked at the population sizes of endangered plants and animals at the time of listing. And this is for species in the United States. And so here on the y-axis, the number of listed taxa falling into various size categories. And as you can see, these are, this is a logarithmic scale. The point that I want to make is when we looked at animals as a whole, the median population size at time of listing back then was a little over 1,000 individuals known to exist for vertebrates, and less than 1,000 individuals known to exist for invertebrates. When we looked at plants at the same, again, under the same criterion, presenting the data in the same way, we found that the median population of reproductive individuals known to exist at the time a plant was added to the endangered species list was a whopping 120. I believe that, at least informally, these data were updated by using Federal Register notices, which usually contain this information. Not that long ago, maybe about 8 years ago, but were never published, and I'm not sure why. And the reanalysis showed pretty much the same story, that the numbers, including more recently listed species, weren't all that different from what we found back in '93. So I am betting quite strongly that the picture hasn't changed. But I would point out that it would be a great project for someone to just go through Federal Register notices since '93 and actually look at the distribution of population sizes and total number of individuals, number of populations for plants and animals added to the list. But again, my prediction is it hasn't changed, and they are really quite rare by the time we get around to protecting them. I also want to make the case, if we want to move beyond the United States, that that's probably the norm globally. And my somewhat indirect evidence of that comes from the wonderful work of the Alliance for Zero Extinction. This was originally presented in a paper in PNAS by Taylor Ricketts and colleagues. And basically, they were looking for sites around the world that harbored the last known population one remaining, of a species of bird, mammal, crocodile, iguana, turtle, tortoise, reef-building coral, or conifer. And they were able to identify 588 sites around the world containing a total of 920 species. And each one of these species then was down to a single population. And this is just a map showing some of the AZE sites in the Australia-Pacific region. So again, I think there's little doubt that if we were to look globally, we would find that there are an awful lot of highly imperiled species that are down to very small numbers of individuals, very small numbers of populations. And yet, I have a sense that we've been surprisingly successful at saving small populations. And I'll have to tell you why I say that. Naturally, I wanted to look at this for birds because, birds. And so what I did was I went through and I looked at all of the North American bird species, and I included Hawaii, that were on the IUCN red list. That is, birds that had a status of either extinct in the wild, critically endangered, or vulnerable. And so here's the list from the mainland United States, and here are the additional species from the Hawaiian archipelago. I took off a few species that IUCN regards as critically endangered, potentially extinct, that I thought were gone. And I then just started looking for information on population sizes and population trends for these birds, again using the database that BirdLife International maintains, because they are in charge of the IUCN Red List for birds. And what I discovered, not surprisingly, is that most of these species are declining. No doubt about it. They are actively becoming rarer. But there are some interesting success stories that you can find among them. So here's a set of 7 species: Bermuda petrel, California condor, whooping crane, Hawaiian goose or nene, Laysan duck, short-tailed albatross, Laysan finch, representing a wide range of orders and families among birds. And what I've plotted here is the lowest population that species was known to achieve and then as close as I could get to the most recent population. And if you think about it, there are some remarkable comebacks represented by the list here. So, for example, the Laysan duck, down to 7 individuals on Laysan in the early teens, now up to close to 900 individuals. The whooping crane is a classic, from about 15 individuals in the late 1930s to currently over 500 if we count the captive birds, about 300 if we count only the wild birds. The condor in the early 1980s reached a low of 22 if we count the captive birds and the reintroduced birds, now over 350. And certainly, back when I was a graduate student, there was a tendency to write off anything in these low population sizes as goners, but that hasn't really been the case. It's a fair question to ask, okay, fine, these are the ones that have been rescued from incredibly small populations. How about the ones that didn't make it? I'll get to that in a moment. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting and arguably a somewhat inspiring picture of what can be done. I should also point out that in connecting the dots, I use a dash line because I certainly don't want to imply linear progress in saving these species, and many of them have had significant ups and downs and population fluctuations along the way. But I would argue that every one of these birds is significantly better off today than it was at its native. And we're not the only ones who have had this sort of success. Our colleagues in New Zealand, thanks in large part to both the availability of offshore islands for translocations and an admirably ruthless willingness to shoot, trap, kill the things that prey upon their native birds, have pulled through a number of species. And I just give you 2 of the more remarkable examples. The black robin, from 5 individuals down to 180, and this 5 included, I believe, 1 reproductive female. The kakapo, from about 70 individuals to roughly twice that number. Nor is it just limited, interestingly enough, to the developed world. So the Ecuadorians have done a magnificent job with the only remaining population of the pale-headed brushfinch, really in the course of about a decade. Through cowbird control and habitat protection, they have increased its numbers by 4-fold. And the Colombians have launched an admirable program to save the yellow-eared parrot. And even though this is a long-lived bird with a relatively low reproductive rate, over the course of less than 20 years, they have managed to both secure its habitat and via nest boxes increase the population from less than 100 to over 1,000. So, I said you can point out examples of small populations that have rebounded, but the question is, well, how many of the small populations of birds have disappeared? And I don't have, at this point, any great sense of what the probability is that a small population will disappear even if we try to rescue it. I did put together, though, a list of the birds covered by the federal government of the United States that have disappeared since passage of the Endangered Species Act. It's a depressingly large number. It is, by the way, the largest number of any country on Earth. We're number 1. Although I would point out that it really is centered amongst extinctions in the Pacific Islands, in particular, the Hawaiian archipelago, and some of the Pacific Trust territories. There's another interesting project to be done that would look at the history of the birds that made it, the birds that didn't, and try to discern key patterns that may explain these differences. My hunch is disease is a big factor. We really have no idea, frankly, how to protect birds in the wild in the face of disease. How are the yellow-billed magpies doing on campus, I ask? At the same time, given what I showed about our ability to pull back small populations, I was very interested to look at the current population sizes of all the red-listed birds in the United States. And again, plotting them on a logarithmic scale, the number of species falling into different population category sizes. The median population size of a red-listed bird in the United States today is almost 7,000 mature individuals. And that actually gives me some cause for hope. That strikes me as a number that we can work with, a number that we can take some hits, do some work with, be somewhat risky with some of the individuals, and basically have the expectation of pulling through these birds. And in fact, I will even argue that there should be no further avian extinctions in the United States, at least based on what we know today about the threats to those species, given this population distribution. But again, I want to make the point that in protecting these species, it takes time. So please note that the axis here goes from 1910 to 2010, and some of these birds we've been working with for a long, long time, like the whooping crane. And it's still not off the list, and it's not going to be off the list for a long, long time. So it requires patience. And ultimately, I think we have to recognize that we are entering an era where the human footprint on the land is so great that a lot of these birds will never be recovered in the classic sense of recovery, and I have no doubts this applies to many other taxa as well. So again, if we look at that group that we pulled through from an incredibly small population, the Bermuda petrel, the California condor remain highly dependent on ongoing conservation measures. The success we've had with the whooping crane, the short-tailed albatross, the Laysan duck, the Laysan finch, that's a product in large part of ongoing translocation programs, constant vigilance, particularly for some of the island species. And getting back to a bigger point, as Mike Scott and colleagues have noted, a large proportion, he estimates more than 80%, that strikes me as high, but perhaps not off the mark, of endangered species are what he calls conservation dependent. That is, for the foreseeable future, perhaps forever, they are going to depend upon management activities such as prescribed fire, control of invasive species, control of predators and parasites, that sort of intensive management. And the number of birds that will be like the peregrine falcon, where we achieve a recovery goal and we can walk away, are likely to be very few indeed. Classic example, of course, of a conservation-dependent bird, Kirtland's warbler, which has increased by an order of magnitude over the course of about 40 years. In fact, the IUCN no longer has it as a red-listed bird, and as a consequence of intensive habitat management, removal of parasitic cowbirds, it staged this recovery. But if we were to cease either of these activities, there's a real chance that the numbers for warbler would crash. This means we're going to face a significant financial burden in terms of habitat management. And this is often neglected, conservation planning, but it's a big concern. It's why organizations like the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Nature Conservancy now plan their conservation activities with endowments in mind to perform the necessary management activities. There is, I think, a valid question if you are a conservation entity, government or non-governmental, whether the need to have the proper endowment fund should take precedence over saving the habitat, sort of a fight between the bulldozers and the weeds, but that we will need this money is clear. And I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time, but just to say when we've done the numbers, the amount of money for habitat management invariably falls well below what's needed. And we run a management debt issue in the sense that the longer we wait to do the necessary management, the higher the cost on a per acre basis, and often, of course, at greater risk to the species themselves. I flag this as one of the biggest conservation issues we're going to face coming into the future. And lastly, our political considerations do not really reflect the rarity of species. So from fiscal year 2011, this is the Fish and Wildlife Service's expenditures. Actually, it's all federal expenditures on endangered species. Salmon aficionados must be pleased with this, but realistically, are these the species in greatest need of conservation in terms of preventing their extinction? I leave that to you to decide. I also, by the way, last night looked at the 10 birds that get the most money. It's red-cockaded woodpecker, northern spotted owl, piping plover, southwestern willow flycatchers, least terns in the interior, least terns in California, least Bell's vireos, marbled murrelets, western snowy plovers, and Florida scrub jays. Not at all aligned with the rarity or the immediacy of threats to those species. So our expenditures do not reflect the risks to those species. Let me close then with an optimistic short-term forecast and an optimistic long-term forecast. The short-term forecast is that we're going to face a growing number of rare species that do escape extinction because of intensive management of small fragments of habitat. And the optimistic long-term forecast isn't that different. It's a growing number of rare species that require less management and are at less risk of extinction due to a combination of habitat management and habitat restoration. Why is this optimistic? Think about the alternative. Thank you very much. Gentleman in the back.
I'm wondering how generalizable these results are to other taxa, because we pay so much more attention to birds than we do to mollusks.
Yes, my hunch is that birds are probably, in many ways, a best case scenario, that when we get down to protecting endangered unionid mussels or endangered plants, things like that, their populations are even more fragmented. Our knowledge of what it takes to recover them is even weaker. And so I would expect that the challenges we face of intensive management of the populations, careful monitoring, will be as great or greater for other taxa than they will be for birds. I don't have a more optimistic view of the non-feathered groups.